The sun was merciless that morning over Tan Son Nut Air Base, Saigon, 1966. The air shimmered with heat and jet exhaust. The smell of fuel, sweat, and fear hung thick. As the rear ramp of a C-141 Starlifter groaned open, a group of young women stepped out, their crisp white uniforms already clinging to their skin in the tropical humidity. They were not soldiers. They carried no rifles. And yet, they were walking straight into a war that would test every limit of human endurance. The voice of the narrator cuts in, calm, deep, and deliberate. They were daughters, sisters, and wives sent to a land half a world away. Their mission was not to kill, but to heal. But in Vietnam, even angels bled. Most of these women were barely 23 years old. They had trained in clean, quiet hospitals across America, and now found themselves surrounded by the constant whine of helicopters, the distant thump of artillery, and the echo of screams carried by the wind. As one nurse later wrote in her journal, "I thought I knew what war was. Then the first medevac arrived, and I realized I knew nothing. The 24th Evacuation Hospital near Long Binh would become their new world. A canvas city of medical tents and metal huts, each one trembling every time a Chinook roared overhead. Inside, heat pushed beyond 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Sweat dripped from helmets onto open wounds. Blood mixed with disinfectant in a smell they would never forget. The first patient of the day was a 19-year-old Marine, shrapnel wounds across his chest, missing 3 fingers, whispering for his mother. Second, a Vietnamese child, no older than 10, burned by napalm. Third, an enemy soldier barely breathing, and the nurses treated them all without question, without pause. We stopped asking who they were, one nurse recalled. After a while, they were just boys, all of them someone's child. For 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, they worked through the endless stream of broken bodies. They cut through uniforms, stemmed bleeding, injected morphine, and whispered comfort that rarely reached consciousness. They learned to operate under mortar fire, to sleep through helicopter landings, and to block out the cries of pain just long enough to move to the next patient. There was no front line here. The war was everywhere. Outside, the jungle hid snipers. Inside, the wounded fought invisible battles. And through it all, the nurses became something the soldiers didn't expect. Their final voice, their last face, and often their only memory of home. In one of her letters home, a nurse named Lieutenant Ann Reynolds wrote, "Mom, don't worry about me. I've seen the worst of it already. But when the helicopters come at night, I still close my eyes and pray the next one won't be full." She was 22. She had been in Vietnam for only 8 days. The narrator's voice returns, slow and reverent. They came to Vietnam believing they could save lives. They didn't know the war would take pieces of their own. Outside the ward, the sun sank behind the palms. Another helicopter landed, its rotors chopping the dusk like a heartbeat. The sound that would follow them forever. The blood and the laughter. The days blurred into each other. Morning, night, and nightmare all looked the same. For the nurses stationed at the 24th Evacuation Hospital, time didn't move by the clock, but by the sound of helicopter blades. Every new arrival meant another wave of wounded. Every thud of rotor wash carried a story that would end on one of their operating tables. Inside the surgical ward, the light bulbs buzzed weakly against the humidity. The air smelled of iodine, diesel, and blood. The nurses moved like ghosts, calm, efficient, mechanical, because panic could kill. We learned to smile even when we wanted to scream, one nurse said years later. If the patients saw fear in our eyes, they'd lose hope. So we pretended to be brave until we actually were. They worked shoulder to shoulder with surgeons and corpsmen, cutting away bandages soaked through with blood, holding pressure on arteries, whispering to soldiers who were fading too fast. Sometimes they sang, off-key, softly, just to keep the silence from swallowing them. Private James Carter, 19, had both legs shattered by a landmine. He was awake during the operation, whispering, "Tell my mom I made it home." The nurse holding his hand squeezed tighter and lied, "You'll tell her yourself, Jimmy. You'll tell her yourself." He didn't make it. She still remembered the warmth leaving his hand 30 seconds later. That night she went outside, sat on an ammo crate, and laughed, uncontrollably, almost hysterically, because if she cried, she knew she wouldn't stop. It was laughter that saved many of them, the kind that burst out in the middle of madness, the kind that kept the darkness at bay. One nurse recalled how they used to decorate IV bottles with cartoon faces. Another confessed to stealing a Jeep just to drive to the next camp for ice cream. "You either laugh or lose your mind," she said. "Sometimes we did both." But laughter was only a fragile wall against the horror. Every night after the last patient was stabilized, the nurses cleaned the floors, mopping blood that wasn't even dry yet. And in that silence, the weight of the day finally crashed down. Some prayed, some smoked until dawn, others just stared into the dark, waiting for the next helicopter. The narrator's voice grows quiet, reflective. They didn't fight the war with bullets. They fought it with hands that trembled, voices that calmed, and hearts that refused to give up, even when everything around them had. In one letter home, Nurse Carol Yost wrote, "We don't talk about bravery here. There's no time for that. We just do what has to be done and pray that someone will still remember us when it's over." But the truth is, few would. When soldiers came home, the cameras rolled. When the nurses did, the world stayed silent. Yet in those tents, under the flickering fluorescent lights, they kept a broken army alive. A doctor once said, "Without those women, half of us wouldn't have made it." And he wasn't exaggerating. That night, a storm rolled over Long Bend. Rain pounded the canvas roofs like artillery. Inside, the nurses worked barefoot, wading through puddles, their scrubs soaked, because the wounded couldn't wait for the weather to pass. A young nurse named Lieutenant Linda Steer wrote later, "I used to think thunder was just a sound. After Vietnam, it's a memory that makes my hands shake." Outside, lightning flashed over the jungle, and inside, beneath the hum of generators, another day of war began before the last one had ended. The voice of the narrator fades in, calm but heavy. The world would never see them as soldiers. But make no mistake, they fought their own war every single day. When war comes to the ward, the nurses had always known the danger, but knowing and facing it were two very different things. By 1969, the war had come home to every corner of South Vietnam, and the field hospitals were no longer safe zones. Mortar shells fell within sight of the wards. Snipers took shots at ambulances. Even the Red Cross, painted on the roof, a universal symbol of mercy, became a target. At Chu Lai and Pleiku, the enemy struck at night. Sirens screamed, lights died, and chaos swallowed everything. And through it all, the nurses stayed at their posts. "We didn't run," one nurse remembered. "We couldn't. There were too many who couldn't move, and we weren't leaving them." Inside the 71st Evacuation Hospital, nurses crouched beside their patients as explosions thundered outside. They held IV lines with shaking hands while plaster dust rained from the ceiling. One shell tore through the nurses' quarters, missing them by less than 20 feet. The voice of the narrator lowers, "They were trained to stop bleeding, not to dodge bullets. But in Vietnam, no one had that choice." Then came June 8, 1969, the day that would carve a name into history. First Lieutenant Sharon Ann Lane, 25 years old, from Canton, Ohio, serving with the 312th Evacuation Hospital at Chulai. At 6:05 a.m., a single Soviet-made 120mm rocket struck the ward where she was working. The explosion ripped through the operating area. Shrapnel tore through her chest. She died instantly. The narrator pauses, a silence heavy enough to feel. She was the only American military nurse killed by enemy fire in Vietnam, but every nurse who served there knew it could have been them. Her death sent shockwaves through the medical corps. For months, nurses wrote her name in the margins of their journals, on the backs of photos, on the walls of their bunks. Not out of fear, but to remember why they stayed. After Sharon, one nurse said, "None of us ever felt safe again, but somehow we stopped caring about safety. We just wanted to finish the job." And the job never stopped. Helicopters kept landing. Blood kept flowing. The wounded kept coming. In one 24-hour period, the 95th Evacuation Hospital admitted 304 patients, many burned, many dying. The nurses worked without rest, wearing rubber gloves slick with sweat and blood. Some fainted from exhaustion, woke up, and went right back to work. When the bombs weren't falling, the psychological war began. Every loud noise, every thump, every shout triggered panic. Even years later, they would flinch at the sound of fireworks, memories exploding in their minds like mortars. One nurse decades later said quietly, "The war didn't end for us when we came home. It's still there every time I close my eyes." As the narrator's voice deepens, in the heart of the battlefield they carried no weapons. Yet their courage was bulletproof. That courage became the thin line between life and death for thousands of men. And for the women who gave everything, even their peace of mind, Vietnam would forever be the place where innocence was buried and resilience was born. The scene fades to the sound of rain hitting metal roofs, a helicopter taking off into the dark. In the distance, the faint echo of a nurse whispering, "You're going to be okay, soldier. You're going to be okay." But in Vietnam, okay was a word that never quite fit. Sisterhood in hell. They called themselves the lucky ones, not because they were safe, but because somehow they were still alive. By late 1969, the war had devoured everything normal about life. Meals were eaten standing, sleep came in fragments, and laughter had to fight for air. But in the middle of that madness, something powerful grew. Sisterhood. The nurses of Vietnam became each other's anchors. They shared everything: uniforms, letters, cigarettes, secrets, and nightmares. They called each other by first names, nicknames, or sometimes just, "Hey you," because tomorrow that name might be written on a tag and sent home in silence. At night, after the last patient was stabilized and the generator hum softened, they gathered behind the wards, 6 or 7 women sitting on sandbags, boots off, feet blistered, uniforms streaked with blood and mud. One would light a cigarette, another would hum a song, and for a few precious minutes, they were just girls again. We laughed about the dumbest things, one nurse recalled. Somebody's hair getting stuck in a fan, or a frog jumping into the shower. That laughter, it saved our sanity. Sometimes they told stories about home, parents, boyfriends, beaches, and plans for after. But no one really believed in after. Vietnam had a way of swallowing the future. When new nurses arrived, fresh-faced, nervous, smelling like soap and optimism, the veterans took them in like sisters. They taught them how to move when mortars hit, how to breathe through panic, how to detach just enough to survive. One nurse, Lieutenant Donna Rowe, said later, "We learned to cry together and to stop crying together, because once you started, you might never stop." In the middle of all the death, they found ways to live. They decorated the tents with Christmas lights made from IV tubing. They held birthday parties with C rations and melted chocolate bars. They even adopted a stray puppy and named him Doc. "We created little pieces of home," said one nurse, "just enough to remember who we were before the war took it away." But sometimes even sisterhood wasn't enough to shield them. The nights could be long and cruel. When the helicopters stopped coming, the silence became unbearable, because that silence meant there was nothing left to save. One nurse described waking up screaming in her bunk, thinking she heard the moans of a patient who had died hours earlier. Another wrote in her diary, "I've started talking to the dead." Maybe because they're the only ones who never leave. They built walls around their emotions, invisible armor to keep from breaking, yet every once in a while those walls cracked. After one particularly brutal day, Nurse Patricia Jeffries found herself holding a dying enemy soldier, a Viet Cong barely 16 years old. He was terrified. She didn't understand his words, but she understood the look in his eyes, so she held his hand until he stopped breathing. That night she sat outside and whispered to the jungle, "I don't even know his name, but he looked like my little brother." The narrator's voice lowers to a soft, almost reverent tone. They were surrounded by death, but they refused to lose their humanity, and in that, they found a kind of victory the war could never destroy. For all their exhaustion, fear, and pain, they saved tens of thousands of lives, but the cost was measured not in blood, but in memories that would never fade. The bond between them became something sacred, forged in fire, sealed in loss. Even decades later at reunions, they would still recognize each other instantly. A single glance, a shared silence, and the war was there again, alive in their eyes, echoing in their hearts. "No one else will ever understand," one nurse said. "Only the girls who were there, only us." And in that understanding, they found the strength to go on. The narrator closes the segment with a quiet truth. They entered the war as strangers. They left as sisters, bound not by blood but by survival. The scars no one saw. When the war finally ended, they thought they'd left hell behind. But for many nurses of Vietnam, the hardest battles began after they came home. They stepped off the plane to cheers and music meant for the men. But no one was waiting for them. No band, no banners. Just silence. Some were mistaken for flight attendants. Others were asked, "Oh, were you a secretary over there?" Few wanted to hear about the nights they held a dying 19-year-old in their arms, or the screams that still echoed when they tried to sleep. America had grown tired of the war, and it turned its face away from those who had lived it. "We came home invisible," said Lieutenant K. Bauer. "The men got medals. We got silence." They tried to fit back into normal life, to be daughters, wives, and mothers again. But how do you go from saving lives under rocket fire to standing in a grocery line, pretending everything's fine? Some returned to nursing, others couldn't. The smell of antiseptic or the sound of helicopters would trigger memories so vivid they'd collapse into tears. One nurse, Janice Plumer, recalled, "I'd wake up in the night sweating, convinced I was back in the ward. I could smell blood. I could hear the wounded calling for help. They were told to move on, to forget, but forgetting was impossible. Many suffered from what we now know as PTSD, though at the time it had no name for women, no counseling, no veteran support. They were expected to be grateful, to be quiet. People said, 'You were lucky, you came back.' But I didn't come back whole," one nurse said softly. Some turned to alcohol, some to solitude. A few even returned to war zones years later as humanitarian nurses, searching, perhaps, for closure in the chaos. But time began to heal in unexpected ways. In the late 1980s, Vietnam veterans, men and women, started reuniting. For the first time, these women finally spoke out. They shared their diaries, their trauma, their laughter, and their guilt. And in 1993, something extraordinary happened. At the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., a new statue was unveiled, the Vietnam Women's Memorial. 3 bronze nurses, one cradling a wounded soldier, another looking to the sky, another kneeling in exhaustion. It was the first time America truly saw them. Tears flowed freely that day. Some hadn't cried in 20 years. The sound of names being read, men they'd once tried to save, echoed through the crowd. One of the original Vietnam nurses placed her hand on the bronze shoulder of the statue and whispered, "We're home now." The narrator's voice softens, filled with reverence. They didn't wear combat boots into battle, but they fought just as hard. They didn't carry rifles, but they carried the wounded and the weight of every life lost. Their scars may not have been visible, but they were carved deep within the soul. Scars that spoke of courage, compassion, and sacrifice in a world that had forgotten to listen. "We weren't heroes," one nurse once said. "We were just doing what needed to be done. And yet, history now remembers them." The women who faced war's darkest hour and still managed to bring light. As the screen fades to black, the final line echoes. They went to war as healers and came home as warriors.